Chapter 4 The Golden Sword. Jack was staring into a house that was twice as big as his own, and Emma's head was darting from side to side as she stared up, down, and all around the walls. There were antlers of animal heads of all kinds hanging next to each other. Jack thought it was rather intimidating, but after having gazed at the walls for what seemed like several minutes, both his and Emma's eyes met Mrs. Thorland's. She was a rather large woman, and gave the impression that if you crossed the line with her, she would put you in the right place. She had dark brown hair that just hung above her shoulders, with brown eyes to match, and a nose that was slightly too wide for her face. "Hi," said Jack and Emma simultaneously. They both looked at each other with a look that said, "Who should speak next?" And just as Jack took a breath and was about to introduce himself, Emma stepped forward and confidently introduced the pair of them. "Let's try that again, shall we? Hello there. My name is Emma Datness of Fronston, and this here is Jack Hart." Mrs. Thorland scanned Emma up and down with her eyes like an X-ray, and suddenly the judging looks on her face vanished, and a wide, welcoming smile appeared and now gave the impression of a loving mother greeting her favourite child. As she spoke to Emma, her voice was warm and calm, and with no trace of a husk at all. "Oh, hello, dear. Please, come, sit down," she said as she directed them to the couches. Jack was eager to sit on what looked like the softest armchair he had ever seen, but unfortunately Mrs. Thorland had occupied it first. So he settled for the rough-looking couch on the left side armchair, and Emma took the vacated seat next to him. Jack watched Mrs. Thorland, who was looking at Emma almost the exact same as he had when the two of them had met. It was a great look of awe and approval. "Jacob!" shouted Mrs. Thorland almost out of nowhere, with the husky sound back in her voice. It was such a loud yell that Emma gave a slight jump, and Jacob came dawdling into the living room without any sign of fear at all. Clearly he was used to being addressed this way. "How long have you known this woman, and why haven't you brought her around here before now?" she asked loudly. "What?" asked Jacob, looking at his mother as though he was talking to someone who was mad. "I've only known them both for about an hour, I think. And what does that have to do with anything?" he asked. "Come on, you two. The books are down here." Jack was immediately up and out of his chair, and felt slightly relieved that they were leaving the presence of Mrs. Thorland. During the entire time in the living area, he was only acknowledged once, and that was only because Emma had said who he was. "Your mum seems nice, Jacob," Emma said as she followed the two boys down the hallway. Jacob laughed. "Yeah, because she thinks I finally brought a girl home. She's been egging me on about trying to find a nice girl to go out with." There was a slight look of annoyance on his face now, and there was Emma looking happier than she had all day. "Oh? So why haven't you?" she asked, trying to sound not too keen to know the answer. "I guess I'm just not that bothered with it right now, and living with Tom, I'd never get any privacy." Jack saw Emma's smile disappear instantly. The three of them entered the room, and Jacob closed the door behind them so as not to be interrupted. "Right," said Jacob, clapping his hands together and rubbing them. "If we want anything that's slightly related to what we're looking for, it'll be over here." And he reached to the shelf with the most cobwebs. The others went over and started to begin looking for anything to do with Euthyphmus. How very exciting it was to finally be looking for something that was new for Jack. But as he looked through book after book, the excitement was leaving him bit by bit. It had almost been 2 hours since the search began, and they were getting nowhere. Half the books were in what seemed to be some sort of foreign language that none of them could read, so they would be no of any help at all. Other books had chunks missing out of them, so if there was anything useful in there, it would suddenly come to a stop, and the subject would be changed entirely. They were all starting to understand why the books were so covered in dust and no one had touched them for what seemed like years. "Have you guys found anything yet?" asked Jack to the silent room, trying not to sound desperate. "Nothing at all," said Emma simply, with her nose barely inches away from the pages. "I haven't seen anything useful either," said Jacob, closing yet another book in his left hand loosely so 5 pages fell onto the floor. "Are you guys hungry at all?" asked Jacob suddenly, remembering that he hadn't offered his friends anything since they arrived. "How are you thinking of food right now?" asked Emma in a tone of shock. "The answer to what we're looking for could be in one book away, and your mind is on what's in your cupboards. honestly. She went back to the books without speaking. So that's a no from you then. What about you, Jack? Feel like a snack or anything? Now that Jack thought about it, he was rather hungry. His stomach was beginning to make soft rumbling noises. He was about to say yes when he looked over at Emma and saw how focused she was on finding anything to do with Eurythemus. He too wanted to find something, anything about the legendary wizard, so he looked up at Jacob and said quietly, "No food for me, thanks, Jacob. But could I have some water? All the dust is making my throat dry." "Yes, of course, no problem. I'll be back in a moment," said Jacob, as he got up and left the room. No sooner did Jacob leave the room than did Emma slam her book shut and fall back onto her chair. "I can't find anything at all," she said in an audible whisper. "I've been through that many books, and now they're all starting to look the same." "Yeah, I know what you mean," said Jack, staring at the ground. "To be honest, I would have thought one of us had found something by now." Moments later, Jacob returned not with one, but 3 full, fresh mugs of water for everyone. He sat down in the chair closest to him, showing no sign of interest to pick up another book. "I'm sorry, guys," he said. "I thought it would have been better than this. I thought we'd have answers by now." "Well, how about we stop looking for something that no one knows nothing about for 5 minutes and look for something that actually exists?" said Emma once again in her authoritative voice. The 2 boys looked at each other with complete confusion on their faces. "Jack, what were we looking for before we met Jacob?" asked Emma, who seemed to be getting rather agitated about the whole thing. "Oh, a map," he said, coming to his senses. "Of course. Surely there must be one in these books. Does anyone remember seeing one?" They both shook their heads. "We really are a hopeless bunch," said Jacob with a smile on his face. So, abandoning the dusty cobweb-infested shelf, he headed towards the other side of the room and started running his fingers across a shelf that looked like it was newer than the rest of the books were much thinner. They all chose a book and then started examining them page by page. Jacob was leaning on his back against the bookshelf, Emma sat back in her wooden chair, and Jack was across from her on the floor with his legs crossed, and the book was on his lap. Jack couldn't help but feel like this was very similar to when him and Emma were looking in Wrangleton for where to go. Here they were again, looking and trying to figure out where to go next. It didn't help at all that Jack didn't have the faintest idea what he was supposed to be looking for. Up until yesterday, he had never heard of Eurythemus or anything to do with him. Nor did it help that every couple of minutes there would be a vast rapping of knuckles on the door, followed by a high-pitched giggles and the sound of footsteps running backwards and forwards. Jack looked at Emma every time this happened, hoping that Jacob would do something about it, but neither of them showed the slightest indication that they had heard anything. Jack probably thought that Emma must be able to hear it, but obviously wanted to remain as focused as possible. Either that, or she was doing exactly what he was doing, which was simply pretending to be transfixed in hundreds and thousands of words that were inches away from her face. After a little while, it seemed that Tom had given up on his game of annoying the others, when suddenly there was a series of more knocking, but there was no sound of laughter or running footsteps. Jack, Emma, and Jacob all looked at each other, waiting to see if it would happen again. Sure enough, there were 3 more knocks, only this time they were slow and loud. Jack's eyes widened in fear, but also with the smallest sense of curiosity. Jacob, on the other hand, looked very relaxed and slightly frustrated. "Yes, Ma?" he asked loudly. "I'm running out to get more meat and vegetables for tonight," said Mrs. Thorland as she came booming through the wooden doorway. "Oh, no, Mrs. Thorland, please, we really must be," started Emma, only for Mrs. Thorland to cut across her. "Nonsense!" she shouted. "Both you, dear, and John look so underfed. Why, I can almost see his bones." Jack said nothing. He suddenly became very interested in the pattern on the wooden floor. "His name's Jack, Ma," said Jacob plainly. "Sorry, James," she said quickly. "Emma, dear, you're not a vegetarian, are you? Oh, it's no problem if you are, my dear. Just let me know so I can get twice as many vegetables." Mrs. Thorland said all this very quickly, and whilst gazing into Emma's eyes, and as usual, showed no sign that Jack was even in the room, or that he might have been vegetarian. He wasn't a vegetarian in the slightest, but it still would have been nice if she had asked him. Emma gave a great sigh and said quietly, "No, Mrs. Thorland, I'm not a vegetarian. Whatever you bring home will be lovely." Mrs. Thorland gave a great smile towards Emma and closed the door on her way out. "Okay," said Jacob as soon as the door was closed. "She's gone out to get food. which means that you guys are here for dinner, which means that she won't want us going anywhere after that because it will be dark, which means you will have to stay here tonight, which means that we won't be able to start our journey for another day, said Jack, suddenly realizing where Jacob was going with his story. If he was honest with himself, he didn't mind that too much. When Mrs. Thorland was not around, Jacob's house was an amazing place to be inside. Unfortunately, Emma was thinking quite the opposite. She gave another audible sigh before speaking again. "We've wasted so much time already," she said, and she placed her fingers around the handle of her sword again. "Look," said Jacob very quietly and softly, almost talking like a parent trying to cheer up their upset child. "Right now, we still don't know where we're going, we don't have a clue what we're looking for, and I know this really seems like a lost cause right now. Let's just try to keep looking while we have the chance and see what we end up with. And if tomorrow morning comes around and we still haven't gotten anywhere, then I promise that the three of us will just go. We'll pack our stuff and we'll follow the wind, whatever way it's blowing. How does that sound?" His eyes met Emma's, and Jack couldn't help but notice a trickle of water dribbling down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she said, trembling. "It's just that I've wanted to do something like this for such a long time, and now that I'm finally on the path to discovering what made Eurythemus so great in the first place, it just frustrates me that all we've had is roadblocks everywhere." There was a tense silence for a while. Jack felt like he should say so to Emma the same way that Jacob had done. Something comforting. But he struggled to think for what to say. When he suddenly came to his feet, all he could think for what to say was almost the exact same as what Jacob had said. "Yeah, Emma," he said, putting on a nervous hand on Emma's shoulder. "Don't worry too much yet. If nothing happens tonight, then at least we know that tomorrow will be much more exciting." "Well said, Jack," said Jacob, clapping him on the back. "Okay then," said Emma, coming to her feet and making her way back to the bookshelves. "You're exactly right, you two. We're not going to get anywhere huddled in a corner." Jack was still watching Emma with so much admiration that he was afraid she might notice. His eyes dropped to her sword and stared at it for several moments. As he was gazing at Emma gripping her blade, he moved his own hand into his left front pocket and pulled out a little golden sword on a shining gold chain. It started twiddling it in his fingers. Jacob had noticed this, and he was now staring at Jack with a look of wonder on his face. "What's that?" he asked Jack, pointing a long finger at the chain. "Oh," said Jack, thrusting the chain back into his pocket. "Nothing. It's just something my dad gave me when I left yesterday." "It was my mother's." He said the last bit very quietly. "It reminds me of something," said Jacob, scratching his head hard, trying to remember. "Really?" said Jack, bringing the chain out for a much more detailed look. "Yeah, I think I remember my mum, of all people, telling me about something to do with the sword and the black hole." "The black hole?" asked Jack, trying to get his head around what Jacob had just said. "Yeah, it's some sort of ancient cave that has been known to be a spot for people to do magic," said Jacob, sounding as though this information was worthless. Emma looked back and forth between the two of them. "Do you know where this cave is?" she asked quickly. "Not really," said Jacob, still showing no sign that any of this was relevant. "All I know is that it's on the other side of the Remarkables, but where you go once you get on the other side, I have no idea. But I also know that the black hole has another name too." The last few words of his sentence took him a while to say, probably just going for dramatic effect, thought Jack to himself. "What's that?" he asked. "It's also known as the Cave of Despair," said Jacob quietly. "Some folk call it that because apparently when people have tried to do their magic, most of the time it would go horribly wrong, and they would end up accidentally killing themselves, or they would do something even worse, like grow themselves another head." Jack was still hoping that Jacob was going for the dramatic effect from before, because he started to feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Are you even listening to the words that are coming out of your mouth right now?" asked Emma in an exasperated tone. "Of course I am," said Jacob. "I'm the one saying them." "Have you ever thought of who else might have used that cave to do magic? Maybe a wizard of some kind?" said Emma, as her patience was starting to become very limited again. "Do you think Eurythemus used the cave?" shouted Jack, who could no longer contain his excitement about finally having some solid fact in front of him. "It's possible, isn't it?" asked Emma, looking at the two of them with wide eyes. Jacob, however, still had not shown one sign of excitement about the new knowledge. Look, he said firmly, I made that connection a while ago, and to be honest, I thought it seemed too much of a chance that the Great One used that cave. It just seemed too easy for that to be true. Have you ever tried to look for any proof that it might have happened? Asked Emma calmly. You've seen how many books are in here, he said, waving his hand at the numerous amount of books surrounding them. Oh, you're such an idiot, she sighed. Both Jack and Jacob looked at her with wide eyebrows risen, looked at each other, and then back at Emma. Excuse me, said Jacob, laughing. Jack was relieved to see that Jacob was still smiling. Well, I'm sorry, said Emma, closing the book. She was no longer reading due to the constant chatter between them. You hear a great myth that could have possibly happened. You have one of the most packed library rooms I've ever seen, and you've never even bothered to try to take the time to see if it was really true. Jacob stared at Emma with his jaw half hanging open and then looked at Jack for something to say. When nothing came out of either of their mouths, Jacob went back to his original argument. Have you seen how many books are in here? Asked again, with a bit more aggressive than last time, but still with a smile on his face. Emma looked at Jacob and began to smile too. She sighed again and shook her head, turned around from him and Jack and began to study the book once more. Even with the new dose of knowledge between the three of them, it still seemed a great challenge to find anything. They thought now that they were looking for things to do with swords, caves, black holes, and erythemus, they would surely find something before the sun went down. But sadly, there was no such luck, and before they knew it, Mrs. Thorland was booming back through the front door and making so much noise with dinner, Jack thought she brought a live pig home. To this great relief, however, it was only Tom giggling in his high-pitched giggles again. Despite how unorganized the kitchen area was, Mrs. Thorland seemed to have everything under control. There were several plates laid across the table, mugs of water all filled to the exact same level to each plate, and the same amount of food that was on each plate was neatly arranged so everything fitted on it perfectly. It was obvious that both Jack and Emma were not used to this amount of food, whereas Jacob thanked his mum for the meal and tucked right in. Jack had never seen so many vegetables on one plate before. In front of him were potatoes, carrots, corn, mushrooms, gravy, and for the meat was pork, sausages, and chunks of lamb. Emma's mouth was watering, but before too long, she too thanked Mrs. Thorland for the meal and began to eat. Oh, no, my dear, says Mrs. Thorland, sounding like out of breath. It's no trouble at all. You are more than welcome any time of the week. She gave a comforting smile. Again, Jack said nothing, but carried on eating. A thought had just occurred to him. Surely the amount of time they spent in the library had not gone unnoticed. How long before it would be before Mrs. Thorland started asking questions about what they were up to? Was Jacob even planning on telling his mother what their plans were? Or were they simply going to sneak out before the sunrise next morning? The thought made Jack feel uneasy. If Jacob was telling the truth and didn't want them going anywhere now simply because it was dark, how would she feel when she found out they were planning on going on a very dangerous and long journey for something that no one had any idea about? Even in Jack's head, the idea sounded very bleak. However, the story had worked on his father, even if half of it wasn't true. Maybe they would try that approach again. Give off the idea that they actually did have a plan between the three of them, and not just a crazy dream. On the other hand, though, there was Mrs. Thorland's temper. From what Jack had seen already, it seemed very likely that she would erupt in rage, and it would all go horribly wrong. The thought of that made Jack feel almost sick, so he stopped eating for a moment. You all right, Jack? Asked Jacob, bringing Jack back to his senses. Yeah, sorry, I just had a thought about something. Don't worry. He forced a smile and then continued to eat. He supposed that when the time came to bring the plan up to Mrs. Thorland, they would just hope for the best. What's the worst that could happen, he thought. Jack hadn't realized just how fast he was eating because before he knew it, his plate was empty. Just as he thought about going to get a second helping, his stomach made a bizarre sound that he knew that he could not fit any more inside him. Jack and Emma both thanked Mrs. Thorland once again for what was easily the best meal they've ever had, took their plates to the kitchen, and were about to start washing up. Mrs. Thorland shouted from the other side of the room, making Jack nearly drop his plate. Don't worry about that, dears, she shouted, as with that husky voice Jack remembered only too well. Oh, no, Mrs. Thorland, said Emma, trying to explain that it wasn't a problem. Nope. You two are my guests. The last thing I want you doing is my filthy dishes. Jack couldn't help but smile. You two are guests, she said. That felt almost as good as if she had called him by his proper name. Come on, you two, said Jacob. She'll be all right. We've got things to do. And he headed back down the hallway into the library again. Jack and Emma put down the utensils they were holding and followed Jacob back into the old dusty library once more. Right, back to business, said Emma, now scanning a section of the library none of them had yet encountered. Maps, maps, maps! She yelled the last word and startled Jack suddenly, forcing him to turn around. There, in Emma's hands, were 3 large books that only semi-covered in dust compared to everything else in the room. Oh, brilliant! Shouted Jack, taking one of the heavy books that Emma had just handed him. It suddenly dawned on Jack just how big the world must be. A moment ago, there was no sign of maps anywhere. Now, it looked like the world's smallest geography class. A few more moments of silence while everyone tried to find Wrangleton somewhere in the many maps in front of them, when Jacob said loudly, "Here we go," placing the book and spread it out on the floor for everyone to have a good look at it. Jack had to admit, and it looked like Emma would agree with him if he said it out loud, that this was loads more fun than scanning through words. Wild smiles were all on their faces as they put each other's maps together to form one enormous map across the library's entire floor. They had to stand up and step back from it for it quite a bit to be able to take in the enormous picture it created. "Okay, there's Fronston on the right side, down there," said Emma, crouching down to her hands and knees so she could see it up close. "So that must mean that Wrangleton should be just over... yeah, there it is." She wasn't wrong. There it was. Wrangleton was just a tiny little dot compared to all the vast forests and lakes and surrounding areas. The forest in which Jack used to get his firewood, and the very same he had met Emma on the outskirts of, was indeed massive. It spread over 2/3 of a single page and crossed over half of another. Jack's eyes were wildly running around over all the pages to try to take in as much as he could and as fast as he could. "I see it," said Jacob quietly. "Look at the top left corner and tell me I'm wrong." And sure enough, in the top left corner of the gigantic map was a grey patch which didn't really look like anything else on the map, but over the grey corner, the words that made Jack's heart start to race. Black hole. "I can see now why you thought it might have been too much of a coincidence for that to be the place," said Emma, looking at Jacob and hoping he would look back at her. But like Jack, his eyes were now darting around all 4 corners of the picture to see what else he could find. Opposite the black hole on the right corner was the city of Aldorgelu. Not far down from that were the Remarkables. Across on the left from were some more drawings of what looked like houses, and further down from those what looked like another forest. As well as in the bottom left corner, there seemed to be what looked like another forest just a lot smaller than the others. "You know what I've just realised?" asked Jack, still looking at the floor. "If we're walking around and suddenly think we're lost, it's going to be a pain having to bring out all these books to make this enormous puzzle every time." Emma, too, had thought of the exact same thought, and without speaking, she pulled out a blank, filthy piece of paper from the dusky desk behind them and began to draw. Considering how small the paper was, it was impressive how she managed to fit all the important parts, such as Aldorgelu, the Black Hole, and a few forests on it. "Cool," said Jacob, nodding his head, showing her he approved of the drawing. "Do you think we should take Kenny, though, just in case we do come across something and we don't know where we are?" "Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea," said Jack. "If you ask me, I think we should take the one with the cave on it, and possibly even the one with Aldorgelu on it." "Are we going that way, though?" asked Jacob. "The black hole's on the other side of the area. Seems like a long way to me." "You know, Jack, I agree with you," said Emma, talking as though she hadn't heard Jacob's question. "Yeah, we might not be going that way, but who's to say we won't go that way on the way home?" After what felt like another hour or so, the books were finally packed up and put back onto their respectable shelves, and the 3 of them called it a night. It was definitely starting to feel like they had a plan now, and it was obvious that Jack was getting excited, almost like a little child desperately awaiting Christmas morning. They all agreed that in the morning they would wake early, quickly eat some breakfast, say goodbye to Mrs. Thornton and Tom, and they would simply be on their way. Jack, Jacob, and Emma all fell asleep rather quickly, considering how determined they were to get out and start their journey. The last thing Jack remembered before closing his eyes was the image of himself with Eurymachus' weapon and the hero of the lands once more.